Good morning, everyone. Let's get started. I'd like to welcome everyone to the second day of our first conference in our 2016-2017 Andrew Mellon Sawyer Seminar on Documentary Media and Historical Transformations. I'm Joshua Malitsky, and I'm an Associate Professor of Cinema and Media Studies in the Media School. And I'm also the Director of the Center for Documentary Research and Practice, which is developed and is hosting the seminar. Today we're going to continue our screenings lectures and have a roundtable that address the specific topics of documentary colonialism and its legacies, with a particular focus on India, Cameroon, Mozambique, Great Britain, and Portugal. Yesterday we had two events. We had screenings of Indian colonial and post-colonial films curated by Priya Jaikumar, and we also had a screening of Jean-Marie Tinot's Afrique, je te plumerai. So hopefully a number of you had a chance to participate in those events. Today we're going to start with a lecture by Lee Grieveson, followed by a lecture by Priya Jaikumar. We are then going to have a session with a screening and a talk related to Mozambican film in the afternoon, and we'll conclude the day's events with a roundtable that features a number of IU faculty who will address the key topics that have been discussed, that have been raised at the seminar. The seminar itself is sponsored by the Andrew Mellon Foundation and hosted by the Center for Documentary Research and Practice, and we have additional support from IU Cinema, the Media School, the Institute for Advanced Studies, the Black Film Center Archive, and the Department of History. And so I thank them for their support. Now I want to introduce our speaker this morning, Lee Grieveson. Lee Grieveson is Reader in Film Studies and Director of the Graduate Program in Film Studies at University of College London. He is the author of Policing Cinema and co-editor of numerous books vital to the field of cinema and media studies, including Inventing Film Studies, The Silent Cinema Reader, and most recently a two-volume collection called Empire in Film that he did with Colin McCabe. Grieveson works on cinema and political economy and is currently writing a book called The Cinema and the Wealth of Nations. And is the talk from this new book, Lee? Sort of. It's sort of from this new book. And this new work examines the way that cinema was utilized by states and corporations to facilitate the establishment of a transnational liberal political economy in the interwar years of the 20th century. The book has been supported by fellowships from the Leverhulme Foundation and the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And in addition, this new project began a website that you're doing with BFI, is that correct? With the British Film Institute, and maybe I'll mention it, it's www.colonialfilm.org.uk, and it's an incredible resource for people interested in colonial cinema. Professor Grieveson is the author of numerous essays on aspects of cinema history, including Fighting Films, Race, Morality, and the Governing of Cinema, from Cinema Journal in 1998, which was awarded the Society for Cinema and Media Studies Catherine Singer Kovacs Essay Award for Outstanding Essay in English Language for Media Studies. He's on the editorial boards of Cinema Journal, Screen, and the British Film Institute. And he's co-editor with Heidi Wasson of the Cultural Histories of Cinema book series with the British Film Institute. So without further delay, we welcome Lee Grieveson.
Thank you. That was a very kind introduction. Thank you, Josh. How's this working volume-wise? Is it okay in the back? Great. Thank you. Whoa. Sorry, my computer just chose that moment to... I'd like to start by just thanking Josh and Marissa in particular, but all the other people who put work into making this happen. I'm really thrilled and honored to be here talking to you today. So thank you very much for that invitation and for the possibility of contributing to this exciting seminar series. So I'm going to speak quite quickly because I have a lot to say, but I'm going to try and enunciate clearly, and hopefully you'll come to terms with my accent during the course of the lecture. So the media that was cinema was quickly made useful for the fusion of economic, state, and geopolitical logics that powered the intensification of capitalist imperialism beginning in the late 19th century. Broadly speaking, cinema was utilized for purposes of display and what we should name clearly as propaganda. The form that came eventually to be called in the 1920s documentary connected those imperatives and was innovated to facilitate and supplement the forms of imperial political economy that lie at the root of what nowadays gets called, in a pretty successful PR makeover, globalization. But the enmeshing of cinema and media with globalizing capital and state began before the canonical moment of documentary and shaped significant early practices around the complex US imperial war of 1898 that mutated into state practices of media making in the US in the 1910s, fostered on the development of peripheral regions and the promotion of global trade. And I'm going to show just one of those state-made films playing behind me as I speak. It's a film about the construction of the Panama Canal, and it'll become clear why I'm showing that in a moment. Now, indeed, it was the ascension of the US to a position of geopolitical and economic hegemony, exemplified by its control of significant trade and capital flows by 1914, which was when the Panama Canal was completed, and also when the United States became a net exporter of capital to finance the intra-European imperial war of 1914 to 1918. So it's in that moment that prompted the British state to abandon the imperialism of free trade, as it was called, that had been integral to its global hegemony in the 19th century, and instead attempt to foster a walled-off protectionist imperial economy. Now, one epiphenomena of that development, of that doomed effort to shore up geopolitical and economic hegemony, was the creation of a state-run film unit in 1926 in the Empire Marketing Board, which is now commonly regarded as the birth of documentary itself. By that point, though, cinema in non-fictional, didactic, and propagandistic forms had long been useful to imperialism and the dynamics of capital accumulation that structures the modern world system. Our definition of documentary must expand clearly, but I come not to offer yet another definition of the form and term, which sometimes seems to be only ever a paragraph away in scholarship on documentary. But more significantly, our definitional work here at the outset of these seminars of thinking through the connections between documentary and colonialism should be directed at the latter term. What is this colonialism we are exploring? Now, I shall take leave here for a moment of cinema and media, but I will come back to it, so please bear with me. Now, broadly speaking, and laying my sort of relatively straightforwardly Marxist cards on the table, I understand the accelerated imperialism and wave of capitalist globalization in the latter years of the 19th century, from something like 1870 to 1914, to be driven principally by the expansionist logics of capital and its fusion with liberal state interests and geopolitical strategies. I talk here unapologetically even of capitalist imperialism to bring into focus the expanding logics of capital that drove the division of the world system into core, semi-peripheral and peripheral zones, creating in the process an exploitative international division of labor to facilitate the extraction of minerals and resources from peripheral zones that come to be used in the industrial processes of the center and from there circulated globally via newly created infrastructural networks. Now, I list here just a bunch of some of the scholarship that is useful, I think, for thinking about some of these dynamics. Broadly speaking, these dynamics produced informal control through trade and investment, what we might call imperialism, I suppose, but triggered also formal territorial control, that sometimes gets called colonialism when necessary. I'm summarizing some of these tendencies reductively here just as a kind of basis for discussion. I'll sort of talk about them as we go through. Now, I take it that liberal capitalist states played particularly dominant roles in this process because such states take or have historically taken their principal remit to be the expansion and protection of property rights and capital. liberal imperatives to foster so-called free trade, what in the US sometimes gets called the open door, have been constitutively enmeshed with imperialism because both were and are shaped by the logics of capital and its expansion across the world system. Empire is straightforwardly an extractive and circulatory system requiring both the development of new infrastructures in terms of transport and communication and the expansion and global deployment of military forces capable of securing capital and strategic interests. Now, but these logics and dynamics must be understood as far as possible in their historical specificity. I can do little more than offer a simple sketch here, but for now I think that can suffice. So, we can note that the global circulation of the British capital that expanded from the Industrial Revolution and the huge state infrastructural expenditures was facilitated by the establishment of the gold standard that established fixed exchange rates and tied monetary and banking systems into an international system from the 1860s, with the expansion in particular of European trade, and that became a global system, enabling the unprecedented worldwide expansion of capital and circulation of capital in the years 1880 to 1940. Now, parts of that expanded capital were invested in the United States in the 1860s, specifically to fund the building of transcontinental rail lines. You can note here how capital becomes infrastructure to facilitate the circulation of capital. And this necessitated, of course, the confiscation of lands from indigenous populations and its transformation into property. One can see this clearly as a process of what David Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession, updating there Marx's primitive accumulation, and consistent with the enclosure of common lands that was central to early capitalist accumulation. But here the process created also new significant infrastructural networks, both rail lines, those are the telegraph lines, and telegraph lines that ran by their side. And also the capital needed to finance these developments straightforwardly led to the growth of finance capital in the United States. Bankers played significant roles thereafter in the explosion of corporate mergers that took place in the 1890s that produced a number of small, very large corporate entities, globally orientated corporations as well. One example, and I confess it's not a randomly chosen one, would be the capital supplied by the House of Morgan to fund Edison General Electric to develop electrical networks. One epiphenomena, incidentally, of that development was the invention of cinema, or at least the invention of some technologies that helped cinema emerge. And that led eventually to the creation that is now known as General Electric. The same corporation, incidentally, whose PR spokesman was a middling film and television star before later becoming president of the United States in 1981 at the dawn of a new era of intensified liberalism. So capital expanded through the financing of infrastructure, and the growth of a corporate-dominated economy was exported globally, and particularly to Latin America initially in the turn of the century period. Now, I'll come back to the specific dynamics of that process in a moment, but broadly speaking, it was consistent with the imperative of capital accumulation that produced a new round of brutal colonial conquest, in particular in Africa, in the Middle East and Asia in the late 19th century, in the midst of a long economic depression between the years 1873 and 1896. Peripheral and semi-peripheral regions of the world economy were exploited in this process for cheap or slave labor and mined for the mineral and energy resources needed to sustain the industrial capitalism and the second stage industrial revolution. Quite clearly, the intensification of capitalist imperialism fused territorial and economic logics of power, as David Harvey, amongst others, has shown, and the restless expansion of the geographical scope of this system. The fusion of capitalist and state imperatives produced interstate rivalries that led directly to war, and the First World War can be seen in that context, I think. Now, I end this historical and conceptual sketch of the dynamics of imperialism and the capitalist world system, roughly where I began today then, with the late flourishing of a spurt of territorial imperialism by the United States in the complex imperial wars of 1898, pictured by early moving cameras in some of the ways that will play behind me. Now, before we get to their form, Let me note simply that these images of imperial expansion were possible only because of the imperial extraction of resources that were integral to cinema itself as a technology, like, for example, the silver that coats celluloid in order for images to function. This is extracted from the colonial periphery itself. Now, the plot thickens there, of course, because the images that I'm showing you are re-rendered as digital images, and so are inextricably wrapped up in the global chains of extraction and imperialism and exploitation integral to both capitalist imperialism and the very materiality of our media culture. This is Indiana, the USS Indiana. I'm showing that for the local audience. Now, what you can see here are a number of so-called actualities, a form or mode that dominated early film production until around 1903. Brief snippets of real life, frequently one shot, static, as a form of display. Now, the cinema was born principally as a non-fictional form and as what has frequently been called a visual newspaper. In these examples, quite clearly as the display of military and technological might of the US, showing in particular the naval ships that were built in the early 1890s as the US military was professionalized to help facilitate geopolitical strategy and protect the global spread of US capital. Principally made in these examples by the Edison Manufacturing Company, if you recall, themselves recipients of capital from the expansion of finance capital in the US itself. The films document then the birth of the modern US military as one part of the imperative to display state power that has been integral to imperialism. Cinema as a mobile display mechanism was quickly put to work to picture and document the technological advancement essential to both imperialism and the advanced mechanized mass media that was cinema itself. Now, but what underpinned this imperative to display new forms of mechanization, technology, and state strength? The answer necessarily takes us into an effort to understand what wars the US was fighting in 1898, 1899, and why. Often this conflict is labeled simply the Spanish-American conflict, but it was more complex than that and stretched also to conflict with Filipino resistance fighters in the Philippines up to 1902, and the annexation of Puerto Rico, the island of Guam, Hawaii, and parts of Cuba. You might know that Guantanamo Bay, incidentally, was leased from Cuba in 1903 after the Platt Amendment of 1901 had effectively established Cuba as dependent on the US. And this fact itself can usefully alert us to the long arc of US militarized imperialism. Now, principally, the separate conflicts were fought to foster trade routes and establish a global infrastructure of naval bases, treaty ports, shipping lanes, and coaling stations that enabled the US to achieve a territorial foothold and access to commodities, markets, and labor in Latin America and Asia, in particular through the control of the seaways in the Caribbean and the Pacific. As you can see on the map, you can see from the Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines work as a way of orchestrating global shipping structures. Now, the US had in fact been planning for this conflict that began in 1898 from 1894 and used the fighting between Cuban rebels and the Spanish as an opportunity to send a naval ship to Cuba to protect US interests, particularly sugar interests. I'll come back to that later. The ship, incidentally, you can see at the top of the slide, was sunk in an accident that historians always call mysterious. Largely because they're a conservative bunch and they don't like saying black flag. But note that the Cuban radical Jose Julio Marti Perez precisely predicted that the US would provoke a war with Spain, I have a quote there, and that Cuba would thus pass from one imperial power to another. Probably it goes without saying, but as Michel Foucault used to remark better with, that this process of imperial expansion was allied with vicious racial logics that proposed, for example, that the racially inferior Filipinos were incapable of self-governance. Brutal military violence was mobilized to destroy the Filipino resistance and republic. Now, Edison issued a special war catalog of films showing troops leaving for Florida and then from Florida to Cuba and the Philippines, including, as you saw moments ago, slow expanses across new naval ships. Here again at the US Indiana, the marching of soldiers of expeditionary forces, as well as some reenactments of key battles, and eventually concluded with a series of films showing the victorious forces returning home. Incidentally, the image here is from one of the reenactments of the successful killing of a bunch of Filipino resistance fighters. Now, quite simply then, these films documented imperial conflict and expansion and the relatively easy victory of the technologically advanced US Navy that had quickly destroyed the mostly aged wooden ships of the Spanish in ports in the Philippines and Cuba. Indeed, the films stand now as remarkable historical documents of a conflict between historical and emergent imperial powers and the birth of the US imperialism that radically transformed the global system thereafter and the world that we live in now. But are the films documentaries? The definitional question seems to me rather superfluous, trifling even, given their worth to an understanding of a significant turning point in global history, and indeed to the place of cinema as a form of media within that turning point itself. But no matter, because happily I can confirm that yes, they are documentaries. Charles Musser, a brilliant early cinema scholar, has shown how the films were frequently connected together in exhibition programs to narrate the story of the conflict, from troop movement to battle to return home. Beginning, middle, and end, a creative treatment of actuality, enmeshing narrative form and imperial conflict together. Moreover, the films were widely popular with audiences in the 1898, 1899 for the phenomenon of the technologically advanced media that was cinema, so much so that Musser suggests that films of the conflict played a significant role in entrenching the popularity of cinema in the United States. Documenting imperial expansion was important to the birth of cinema as a mass medium. The cultural work of cinema, mass media, to reiterate, was quickly assimilated to the sustenance of imperializing capital. Now, parts of this newly professionalized US military, visible fleetingly in some of the films that we've just seen, were deployed also in Colombia in 1903 in a process that purposefully created the state of Panama to enable the building of the Isthmian Canal we saw in the films earlier, the Panama Canal earlier. You might know the history, but very briefly, the US warship Nashville protected Panamanian rebels from Colombian troops and therefore created the state of Panama, which then immediately leased back the canal zone to the United States, with work beginning on the Panama Canal in 1904. This and the Cuban episode are textbook examples of what used to be called gunboat diplomacy. I have a couple of slides which give slightly different perspectives on this. By the time the canal was nearing completion in 1913, the Congress in the United States devolved funds for the exhibition at the Panama Pacific International Exposition to take place in 1915, and I'm quoting here, "Such articles and materials as illustrate the function and administrative faculty of the government of the United States, tending to demonstrate the nature and growth of our institutions, their adaptation to the wants of the people, and the progress of the nation in the arts of peace and war." Congress is developing money to fund an exposition and the display at that exposition of films about the growth of the United States and its technologies. Now, quickly after the release of these funds in 1913, the United States Department of Agriculture, and I'm going to summarize those as USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, began a series of experiments, and I'm quoting again, to determine the feasibility of taking motion pictures and the educational and promotional value of these motion pictures, that led on to the purchase and construction of the materials necessary for film production, for creating a film production unit that is, I think probably the very first state-run film unit, at least the first that I'm aware of. State-run documentary film unit, USDA, established 1913. Now, over time, the USDA film unit produced significant films about, broadly speaking, the modernization of agriculture, and I shall explore some of that history momentarily. But before that, let me simply note that the USDA film unit was established at that point and was charged with making films for other state bureaus and departments to celebrate the completion of the Panama Canal at the Exposition in 1915. You saw one of those films a moment ago. State planners, that is, marshaled and utilized film as part of the imperative to display the infrastructural power and technological advancement of the state. Now, Greg Waller has shown that non-theatrical pedagogic films were widely displayed at the Exposition in 1915, including films made by the state, but also by significant corporations like Ford and International Harvester. Quite clearly, the celebration of an infrastructural network that radically transformed global trade flows was central to the films made by the state. Cinema again documented the new circulatory networks that were integral to the intensification of capitalist imperialism. It did so also in the context of the broader exposition designed to celebrate the completion of the canal and the ascension of the U.S. to a position of global power. Various forms of the infrastructural circulation fundamental to capital and imperializing capital in particular were celebrated together at the Exposition. One, of course, being the Panama Canal, but here, for example, oops, sorry, you missed the slides of the Exposition. Here, for example, is a picture of the giant telephones, the all-powerful Morgan-financed corporation AT&T. Western Electric is a subsidiary of AT&T, produced to celebrate and displayed at the 1915 Exposition to celebrate the first transcontinental telephone call and its control, AT&T's control of the long-distance telephone networks, integral to the speeded up circulation of information and capital at the dawn of the American century. Now, I think we can push this a little further before I return to the USDA unit. The canal itself was part financed through the House of Morgan and is a significant example of the complex alliances between state and finance capital that deepened in this period, and that was, for example, particularly visible in the 1913 creation of the Federal Reserve banking system. Because of its centrality in financing the canal, the House of Morgan became the chief financial conduit for the state of Panama. Now, the subsequent history of this place, of the place of the invented state of Panama in the global flows of trade and capital is quite fascinating. Probably you recall earlier this year that a large cache of financial records were released that were labeled the Panama Papers. And that revealed the offshore tax havens utilized by the wealthy elite and corporations to avoid paying taxes, to contribute to the public good, and to alleviating the murderous global poverty that blights so many lives. Now, but why were the papers called the Panama Papers? Because the records came from a Panamanian law firm established to make use of the liberal regulations regarding tax and economy that were largely set in place by the US and the House of Morgan in the early 1900s for the purposes of constructing the canal, built straightforwardly in partnership with finance capital. So J.P. Morgan, writes the noted investigative journalist Ed Villamy, led the American banks in gradually turning Panama into a financial center and a haven for tax evasion and money laundering, as well as a passage for shipping, with which these practices were at first entwined when Panama began to register foreign ships to carry fuel for Standard Oil Company in order for the corporation to avoid U.S. tax liabilities. Oxfam, you may remember this because it wasn't so long ago, released a report in the midst of these Panama paper revelations that estimated that U.S. corporations, and they named GE and Apple as central to this, hold collectively $1.4 trillion hidden in offshore tax havens. You might know that many of these other havens are located in former British imperial territories like the Cayman Islands, and that system is central to how their finance capital functions in the City of London. So the invention of Panama and the building of the canal was significant to the orchestration of new trade flows and new patterns of liberal economic imperialism shared out by the state and financial and corporate entities. Capital courses through Panama still, as does a significant part of the flow of global trade. And if this works, I'm going to very quickly show you this fascinating map that sort of intrigues me, which is a map of the movement of all ships in the world in one 24-hour period in 2012. If it works, no, I'm not sure that I can. Oh yeah, look. If my geography is right, that would be the Panama Canal. Anyway, I get lost in this for quite a while, so I'm not going to. The media that was cinema, alongside the built space of expositions, celebrated this global flow at the dawning of a new era of US-led economic imperialism. Now, but what else did the USDA film unit set up in 1913 do? What kinds of films did it produce? What did the state want from film? Now, I shall start answering these questions by beginning firstly with this one. What was the USDA? Well, it was a governmental unit set up by the federal government in the 1860s in the midst of the building of those transcontinental rail lines that I mentioned and related investments in agricultural colleges and higher education to foster economic productivity. The local Purdue University, for example, owes its history to this development, land-grant universities. By the latter years of the 19th century, the department wielded scientific knowledge to develop crop management and animal husbandry and promoted the mechanization of farming to facilitate growth and productivity. It is a good example of how modern liberal states invest in pedagogic practices and institutions to facilitate economic growth. Now, by the early 20th century, the USDA developed a system of so-called agricultural extension that used the network of land-grant state universities and colleges alongside a system of model farms and mobile instruction to disseminate knowledge about farming and economic management. Broadly speaking, the department invested in knowledge production to help facilitate food production, to sustain the population, which is a crucial foundational task of states, to establish a stable rural economy and simultaneously counter the agrarian populist insurgency of the turn of the century period by integrating rural workers into a new national economy. To buttress, this is why the USDA was established. This is, in fact, this is some of the scholarship which will enable us to think about what this institution was. To buttress the urban industrial expansion of the second stage industrial revolution and sustain an industrial economy on a continental scale, and to enable and sustain a mass economy of abundance that could, amongst other things, de-radicalize working class opposition. Now, I'm going to suggest in a moment that we might usefully think about this as a process of what used to be called internal colonialism, that is, the domination of particular regions and particular populations by usually governmental and financial elites. But before I come back to that, let us note the place accorded film in this expansive and extended economic, political, and pedagogic project was very considerable. And I'm going to show you there's a couple of slides here. This is from one of the catalogs of the USDA film unit. By 1934, the film unit had produced around 500 films, many of which documented particular practices, like, for example, how to get rid of ticks on cattle, but also moved over into broad advice about how to live productively and consume productively, how to develop labor-saving devices in the home and things like that. Visualizing new productive practices, film was a form of communication that could be persuasive and pedagogical, and to some extent mobile. It could circulate through the agrarian and extraction-based peripheries of the South and the interior, bringing federal government advice to rural populations in a way characteristic both of the liberal state's imperative to facilitate economic productivity and govern at a distance. Indeed, this is one of the ways in which liberal polities began to use technology to materialize forms of indirect rule. USDA films circulated through the creation of land-grant institutions that purchased films from Washington and then disseminated them through their local communities. By the early 1920s, the departments of USDA's Department of Bureau of Animal Industry innovated also the use of a mobile cinema van that could carry films and a new mobile film projector to ever more remote peripheral regions and make use of the electricity generated from the engine to protect these films of government practice to isolated rural populations under the guidance of extension workers. Whoops. In this image, for example, from the cover of the USDA's 1926 publication called Use of Motion Pictures in Agricultural Extension Work, the department's idealized image of an extension screening shows the USDA's car connected to a brick building built by an extension cord that is powering a light and a film projector that shows a film beginning with the USDA's film logo. The car's headlamp and cone of light provided by the portable film projector outshine the dim moon in the picture, as government technology clearly brings enlightenment brings literal light to the pre-electrified countryside and metaphorically enlightens the population about productive ways to produce and live. Quite simply, the state began to systematically make use of the supposed effective or pedagogical power of film, as well as its mobility, its status as emblematic of a machine-made economic modernity, and its figural articulation of government to position movie watching as a technique of governmental management to facilitate the conditions of capital accumulation. Now, I shall talk very briefly about one of the films the USDA film unit produced. I don't unfortunately have it to show you. Give me 1 second. The film was called Helping Negroes to Become Better Farmers and Homemakers and was made in 1921 in some form of cooperation with the Alabama Polytechnic Institution and the Tuskegee Institute, demonstrating the benefits of extension that the extension system brings to black tenant farmers in eastern Alabama. This film, a scripted film, mixes various registers that is characteristic of non-theatrical pedagogic cinema of this period. Partly it documents farming problems, particularly the problem of the boll weevil, which was destroying cotton crops. But it connects this also to forms of characterization and narrative. It's a hybrid text. Beginning with an introduction, and I have some of the intertitles that I'll mention, to Rube Collins, typical of many Negro tenant farmers in the South and his family. The film seeks to root its general story of farm development to the structures of alignment and allegiance that had become by this point central to narrative cinema. Collins is clearly poor. We see him in a very poor shack at the beginning of the film. And things get worse before they get better. A neighbor appears and tells him that he's found the boll weevil in his cotton crop. At this point in the film, sorry, I don't have it's not digitized. There's an insert of what a boll weevil looks like in a cotton crop. So as the film inserts kind of documentary and informational detail into its narrative, into its story, the agent explains that Rube Collins then has to ride off to a white extension agent who explains to him what is happening and what he has to do about it, telling the farmers how to control the boll weevil pest, following the methods developed by the USDA. Now, by following these instructions then, with the benign oversight of the white landlord who he talks to about this, the problem is solved and Collins becomes richer. 2 years later, an intertitle tells us that better farming has given the Collins family a better home, and a local Negro agent to assist the white agent has become necessary. Collins and his family now live in a larger farmhouse containing several rooms, and the contrast is made explicit in a brief sequence near the end of the film that starts with an intertitle which says simply "the old" and shows his old shack, and then an intertitle that says "the new" and shows his new, much bigger house. The shift from the old to the new here has quite a different valence than, say, in Sergei Eisenstein's contemporaneous film, The Old and the New, about the collectivization of agricultural practices. In the USDA film, the slow pan around the new in Collins's house carefully and slowly presents the material benefits in terms of property that are brought by government extension. But note here that also that the articulation in this intertitle about the old and the new of time passing marks the presence of a narrative form that meshes with the governmental purpose to show the economic benefits of government-led farming practices. So the unstable mix of documentary, fiction, narrative that is common amongst non-theatrical pedagogic films of this period was directed towards facilitating economic productivity. Collins is made modern and becomes a prosperous homeowner because of the intervention of wide extension agents and the state. Now, J. Emmett Wynne, a film historian, has astutely shown how the film ignores a longer history of black-led extension work in the region to locate governmental agency with white authorities and institutions. Wynne's research has suggested that the film was more widely shown amongst white audiences rather than the poorer tenant farmers, black farmers. It may in this way have been sought to be equally educational for white landlords, for the film publicizes the power of government to transform not only the economic conditions of black tenant farmers, but also the economic potential of the white-owned land. Now, coming back to the questions I posed about the history and function of the USDA film unit, here I think are a few responses. The state orchestrated filmmaking to foster economic development, particularly of the rural South and the interior, to facilitate its integration with the new urbanized industrial economy. In time, the state process produced new forms of agribusiness, integrated with new forms of chemistry and mechanization. Monsanto, for example, was established in 1901. International Harvester, with significant financing by Morgan, is also extremely significant to the mechanization of farming in this period. But the South remains even, I'm not really sure of its contemporary history, an undeveloped region. An internal analog historian, Alan Dawley, remarks of Latin America producing raw materials and profits for absentee owners. Here again, it seems to me integral that we understand imperialism as constituted both by hierarchies and conflicts between countries and simultaneously by the elaboration and support for a productive system and the domination and exploitation of some classes by others within that system. Doing so reminds us, and I'm quoting, as you can see from the slide, that the state itself is a form of the class relation which constitutes global capitalist relations, and that it played, in the precise ways that I've tried to sketch here thus far, crucial roles in the breakdown of the resistance of pre-capitalist societies to the dominance of capital. One of the methods for that process was the mechanized chemical form of persuasive film. The USDA experimented with that form, mixing documentary with narrative and the delineation of empathetic characters in ways that straightforwardly position government intervention as the motor of narrative progress. Equally significant was the elaboration of a material network for the circulation of these films, as seen in that slide I showed you with the mobile cinema van, that relied also on a network of extension departments at land-grant universities in particular, i.e. networks of circulation are being established here that position the movement of these pedagogic films in various ways. The state-run film unit innovated new forms of mobile exhibition and new institutional networks to foster the circulation of film, to propagandize populations, to follow new policies for the accumulation of capital. In the example I've talked about here, indeed, populations who were most likely the descendants of slaves forcibly removed from the old world and initially integrated into a British system of liberal imperialism, with the cotton shipped first to Liverpool and then to my hometown of Manchester, before the system mutated into new forms of capitalized and mechanized agribusiness in the early 20th century, fully supported both domestically and globally by the activist state. Now, recall that the Spanish-American War began when the US sent a ship to protect sugar interests in Cuba. And there's sort of several examples of this across the history of the 20th century. For example, the coup that was fomented by the CIA in Guatemala in 1954 was done so precisely at the bequest of United Fruit. Now, cotton can be a useful connecting thread, if you will, to transitioning here to thinking about the British imperialism that was still in the 1920s a globally significant political and economic system. British efforts to orchestrate a newly walled-off imperial economy in the early 1920s produced eventually the Empire Marketing Board in 1926, and it is within that institution that a documentary film unit was established under the direction of the bureaucrat Stephen Tallants and John Grieveson. Documentary begins here, though all I have said thus far suggests a rather different genealogy to that form and practice that locates it broadly within the dynamics of capitalist imperialism and more precisely in the changing dynamics of the world system in the early 20th century. Now, the specific history of the establishment of the EMB film unit can further illustrate this. Now, I've written about some of this before, so I'm going to sort of skip to the headlines here, if you will. In fact, as a way of advertising the site that Josh mentioned, that's one of the places that I've written about this stuff before. Now, broadly speaking, the British state's response to the growing economic power of, in particular, the United States, as well as the devastating cost of World War I and the economic depressions that opened and closed the 1920s, was to develop a partial shift away from the classical free trade liberalism that had been the guiding principle of economic strategies since the mid-19th century, and towards a policy of protectionism and imperial preference that would place a tariff on goods that were imported to the US from outside the empire, an attempt to foster a walled-off imperial political economy. Simultaneously, the British government constructed a new economic and political structures for the establishment of a Commonwealth bloc. Excuse me, sorry. I need to show you that. Whoa. Again, I'm just listing some of the scholarship that helps explicate some of these policies. Taken together, state practices sought to safeguard finance capital and industrial growth, as well as lower levels of unemployment and worker disaffection, all the while fencing off an economic bloc that would, it was hoped, sustain British geopolitical dominance. Didn't work like that, but that's what it was hoped. Let us note, in passing here again, imperialism requires class domination domestically, as well as the exploitation of foreign subaltern populations. It behooves us to see this process as dialectical, I think. Now, culture was integral to these governmental efforts to transact a new imperial political economy in various ways, including imperial exhibitions, the creation of the BBC, 1922, it takes its modern form in 1927, and new state propaganda agencies like, for example, the British Council that we saw briefly in Jean-Marie's film last night. But it's film and documentary that brings us to this room, so I shall stick with that as one crucial component of the governmental use of culture and media to foster economic and biopolitical security. Now, the state's documentary film unit was established within the Empire Marketing Board. So what was this institution? Now, it emerged, the Empire Marketing Board, from an imperial economic committee that was set up in 1924 to foster ways of encouraging a protectionist economy and closer economic ties within the empire. In 1925, this commission recommended that a body be established, and I'm quoting, to produce continuous publicity on a national scale with a view to spreading and fostering the idea that empire purchasing creates an increased demand for the manufactured products of the United Kingdom and therefore stimulates employment at home. Elite state officials at the Board of Trade and the Colonial Office in the UK all supported this suggestion, and the Executive Commission to carry out this continuous publicity was established as the Empire Marketing Board in May 1926. In effect, then, the British government created a propaganda institution to foster the idea of intra-imperial trade as part of a broader economic and geopolitical strategy. One can see this as consistent with a number of developments beginning notably around World War I, and that increasingly positioned propaganda, or sometimes as it was called education, as integral to governmental practice. The USDA is one example of that from 1913, so is the Panama Pacific Exposition in 1915, so is the BBC, and so on and so on. The point I want to emphasize is that liberal states increasingly came to see culture, and increasingly media, as important to government, particularly after the expansion of the forms of mass democracy that was propelled by the exigencies of mechanized mass total war in 1914, 1918. There were new democratic reforms that emerged out of that conflict. Now, documentary was particularly significant to this. The Empire Marketing Board established a film unit under the direction of Stephen Tallents, a civil servant who had played a central role in orchestrating state response to the 1926 general strike in Britain. Tallents employed Grieveson, initially on an ad hoc basis, and the rest is a relatively well-known history. A governmental film unit was established, Grieveson assembled a pool of talent, and began enacting a state praxis that put film to work to foster capitalist imperialism. Grieveson, as you no doubt know, spent a lot of time, a good deal of time, trying to differentiate documentary from previous forms such as the Actualities and the non-theatrical I've explored here, and was a pretty good PR agent for the term documentary. But these distinctions were largely specious, particularly if we look instead at the connecting logics of actuality to non-theatrical to documentary, as I've suggested here. All non-fictional forms, predominantly, often state-produced, integrated directly into the practices of capitalist imperialism that mandated the development of economic regions and their integration into broader economic and political systems in order to foster the security of state and capital. Now, EMB films, the films they produced, this unit sought principally to foster consumption of empire produce in Britain as part of a strategy to wall off this imperial political economy, particularly from the incursions of the United States. Broadly speaking, these films then sought to interpolate working class audiences into an imperial project that was predicated on differing forms of exploitation and on the denial of solidarity between workers across the world. The films frequently focus on the construction of infrastructural networks integral to the circulatory system of capital and empire. And I'm afraid I don't have any good stills from the films themselves, but some of these empire marketing boards make clear this emphasis on circulation of materials and the building of new infrastructures. Now, I shall not say a great deal more about these Empire Marketing Board films because I want to push on to make a few final remarks about the fragmentary interwar development of film production, distribution, and exhibition for overseas colonial audiences. The EMB films directed principally at working class British audiences. I want to talk very briefly now about films for overseas colonial audiences, for those backward races, as it was frequently called in the parlance of the time, in keeping with my effort to discern how film as mass media was utilized by powerful organizations to further consequential political and economic developments. I'm going to concentrate on one influential example, mainly located in East Africa in the mid-1930s, with the development of what came to be called the Bantu educational kinema experiment. Now, the history, I'll spell that out in a minute, but the history of that logic of this experimental use of cinema to educate Africans can be briefly recounted and woven into the fabric of the institutional history that I've been briefly sketching here. In late 1927, 1 year after the formation of the Empire Marketing Board, the Colonial Office convened a film conference, it's sort of sketched out on the slide, in which a Colonial Films Committee was formed to discuss principally the circulation of British films in the Empire, the control of films already circulating, and the production of educational cinema for the benefit of the colonized. In the wake of the conference, the Colonial Advisory Committee on Native Education sent the noted biologist Julian Huxley to Uganda, Kenya, Tanganyika, and Zanzibar to advise upon certain aspects of native education. Huxley took with him a projector and a selection of films supplied by the Empire Marketing Board to various educational institutions. Leading on from the perceived success of this experiment in colonial pedagogy, the Colonial Office subsequently supported a plan from missionary John Merle Davis to show and produce films for the region around and including the copperbelt mines in what was then northern Rhodesia and is now Zambia. Davis allied with a guy called Major Leslie Allen Notcott, who was a sisal plantation owner in East Africa, who himself had previously tried to establish, thought that an estate cinema might be an effective method to maintain a contented labor force. Davis secured funding from the Carnegie Institute, as well as other mining operations in the region, and began an experiment to produce and exhibit cultural, recreational, and educational films for the Bantu people. And this, he was supported by a somewhat cash-strapped Colonial office in London, grateful for the utility of corporate American philanthropy. So, what brought the missionary, the plantation owner, corporate American philanthropy, and the British Colonial Office together? If that sounds like a setup for a joke, the answer is a little bit more prosaic: the management of African mobility and labor in the midst of the massive social transformations wrought by large-scale mineral extraction to serve transnational capital. How's that for a punchline? Now, Davis' proposed project was motivated by an interest in the social impact of local villages of mass labor migration to northern Rhodesia's copper belt, which was the subject of his influential 1932 report, Modern Industry in the African. In this sense, he was part of the wider shift in the interwar years towards a new conceptions of colonial development, albeit one predicated in this case on finding ways to educate Africans in their natural role as agriculturalists, to disrupt the drift of these African farmers and laborers from land reserves into employment in mines and other jobs in the cities, or at least minimize the deleterious consequences of this for the migrant laborers, for the colonial rule, and for the imperial system itself. Rural development in this way sought to align African production to a global market and simultaneously to minimize the forms of political nationalism, contestation over land rights, and an incipient Pan-Africanist movement amongst migrant laborers. Carnegie and the British state found some common ground in these objectives, and we can see the connection between missionary, state, and American corporate philanthropic capital as one example of an expansive development apparatus to modernize the African populations and economies to facilitate their integration into a transnational liberal economy. Now, violent police reprisals in 1935 by workers in the Copper Belt were the flip side to this project of pedagogical hegemony. Now, the 35 films made by the Bantu Educational Kinema experiment between 35 and 37 included several on agricultural matters, including films about crop rotation, seed selection, soil erosion, and cooperative marketing. Various films advertised the colonial government's developments and services. In the first film of this experiment was called Post Office Savings Bank. Two African men working on a plantation handle the salaries they are paid differently. One of them buries it in the ground and has it stolen. One of them takes it to a post office bank and it's secure. The structure of wise and foolish choices, usually embodied in character positions, was very common in colonial pedagogy. Produced by state and quasi-state institutions. In this example, it works to support a colonial banking system, and so, therefore, the extraction of further profit from colonized labor. Various other Beckett films focused on hygiene and disease prevention. The one here is from Tropical Hookworm, for example, 1936 film that showed the step-by-step process of constructing a pit latrine to avoid the hookworm infection. That proliferated in rural areas in sub-Saharan Africa and rendered sufferers exhausted, and I'm quoting, and so constituted a drag on the fiscal health of the empire. In these direct ways, film was integrated with the biopolitical project to manage colonized populations, and in particular, to ensure laborers were productive. Now, quasi-state officials, missionaries, anthropologists, philanthropists all worked from a similar assumptions that there was a unique African mind and that education should take these race-based proclivities into consideration. It became axiomatic in these colonial circles that educational films should, for example, be minimally edited, should move very slowly, because it was assumed that African audiences could not understand them. Watching Africans watch movies became an ideologically charged anthropological and state intervention. Everyone already knew, of course. Sorry, you missed that quite nice slide. Everyone already knew, of course, that the racially inferior Africans were more prone to mimetic responses to cinema, and the Beckett Project was partly designed, as film historian Glenn Reynolds has argued, to capture African viewers and correct the falsehoods perpetuated by the Hollywood dream machines. Now, the films were certainly widely disseminated in East and Central Africa, traveling through Kenya, the mining towns of the Copper Belt in northern Rhodesia, Tanganyika, Nyasaland, and Uganda, in following the same migratory patterns exploited by global capital, and on the back of a 2-ton Ford lorry with a cinema unit mounted on a trailer traveling behind it. So another one of these mobile cinema vans that we've seen before. Vans like this enable the government to take its message to areas often beyond government supervision, extending the visibility of government at the same time as expanding the ability of the state to see. Exhibitions frequently frequently notes were taken about them, frequently utilized the sound on disc system. Often they used, they ended with the British national anthem, for example, a picture of the king. Yet, of course, many of these audiences had never seen moving pictures before. And it seems likely that the films came themselves in some ways to stand metonomically as representative of the technological power of the colonial state, a form of technological shock and awe in the service of biopolitical and economic management of empire. Now, I'm nearly finished, so I'm just going to make some final remarks, give or take. Now, I have a few final observations about the Beckett experiment before I try to make some conclusions here. The first thing to note is that the Beckett experiment mirrored in some ways that enacted by the USDA in relation to the agricultural periphery of the United States. The effort to use cinema to educate rural populations in productive agricultural practices and related ways of living took similar forms and prompted related developments in mobile cinema technology and exhibition. The development of the US South in this way can suggest it functioned as something like an internal analog of the British Empire. The second thing that merits attention here is the alliance between the British colonial state and American corporate philanthropy in developing resources and populations. US corporations and their related foundations were becoming increasingly interested and invested in the resources housed within the British Empire in the interwar years, and this connection in relation to mineral resources is certainly intriguing. Encoded in this shift was one from British territorial empire to US-dominated economic imperialism. Yet viewed in a certain light, the connections are more stable, for the interventions of the USDA were frequently designed to manage the descendants of African populations forcibly removed from their homelands to serve transnational capital, just as the British colonial state sought to manage displaced African populations. The third point here, and somewhat related to the symbiosis of corporate and state interests, is this. The site of these experiments in pedagogy and governance were extremely significant, the discovery of which copper deposits in northern Rhodesia on the border with the Belgian Congo in the early 1920s was a crucial economic and political boon to the British, given how significant copper was to the wired communication networks that themselves were central to imperial governance and economic globalization. Local instability in this region demanded state action then. So if telecommunication is, as some people have argued, capital's essential lubricant, it required the resources dug up from African soil by an occupying power. Nowadays, of course, the Democratic Republic of Congo is one of the central resources for the cobalt that is integral to mobile and smartphones, and the legacies of imperialism have resulted in atrocious mining conditions and ongoing brutal and devastating armed conflict. So the innovation of a pedagogical film project for African audiences in the crucial region of the Copper Belt is another example of the way in which film as mass media, mostly non-fiction media, was integrated with the effort to sustain governance and facilitate the global flow of information and materials. Now, I genuinely am going to finish now. Two very brief speculative concluding remarks. One simple thing to observe, and I've said it, so I'll repeat it. The cinema was quickly utilized to supplement and facilitate forms of territorial and economic imperialism. Frequently, this was non-fictional, and it crossed the categories actuality, education, propaganda, and documentary. The borders of those categories seem to me porous. I'm rather inclined to kick this back old school and call it propaganda. But that word is largely banned from film studies, mostly it seems for two reasons. One, because propaganda is a form that largely precludes the kind of close textual representational reading central to the discipline, to its considerable detriment. Two, because the concept assumes that media substantively shapes people and this is seen as elitist and certainly out of sync with the happy talk of agency and fandom that is central to the liberal and neoliberal academy. But large parts of what I have talked about today has focused on institutions that produced and circulated and showed films to try to influence the belief and conducts of people in the service of fostering, mainly, the security of state and capital. Now, but this does not mean we have to assume that propaganda and documentary worked. The British are a really good example of the failure of all this. British are really often good examples of failure. After all, documentary cinema was integrated with efforts to halt the shifts in the world system that brought the US to its center, but it could only fail. By the point the British innovated documentary, the US commercial fiction film industry, synced itself with finance capital and large tech companies, but this is a different story, had become gradually dominant and had developed, globally dominant, and had developed sophisticated global infrastructural networks for circulating shiny images of consumer abundance around the world. This became central to a new round of imperialism, now more clearly economic than territorial, though they're always connected. And Hollywood relied on support from the state to do that, as it does continually in these large trade agreements, IP protection, and so on and so forth. The imperializing work of media shifts to fiction, and indeed to the creation of media systems that are fundamentally synced to the generation of capital. One might say, perhaps, that documentary is to territorial imperialism what fiction is to economic imperialism. But here is perhaps then the very final twist. Unmoored in part, at least, from state and corporate investments and imperatives, documentary begins to mutate in parts of the world into a radical praxis that explores forms of imperialism and calls for and helps establish new networks of solidarity. And Prexy and Jean-Marie were talking about this last night. Perhaps we might see this as a fugitive form, spreading from examples like worker and union filmmaking in the 1920s and early 1930s to the brilliant innovations of third cinema by Latin American filmmakers in the 1960s, straightforwardly contesting US neocolonialism and what they began to call, for the first time, neoliberalism, that itself migrated and transformed across Africa, the Middle East, and in certain respects flourishes also in China. The crucial imperative to make visible the exploitation and inequality of systems, states, the global system courses through these remarkable films, and we saw one of them last night. New digital recording devices also enable actuality to mutate from state actors to individuals picturing state oppression. But note that the shift from state power to individual or small collectives brings with it a diminution of the kinds of infrastructural and simply capital support available that is always available to state and corporate actors. Our task must be, then, clearly, to create networks of solidarity and support collectively to help take back the power to shape our world in more humane ways. And I'm really, really grateful, as I said at the beginning, to Josh and Marissa and all the others who've worked on this for doing the work that organizes something like this to enable those conversations and collectivities to emerge. And grateful to have the opportunity to contribute. Thank you. Ray, how you doing? Thank you.
Just a comment and a question. The first comment, I'm happy you're keeping it old school. I think that's a really important part of that. And the question is, one area that I wanted to see materialize, you to kind of make this claim in a very direct way, is that film seems to be treated as an infrastructure at this point. And that's something I'm really fascinated by, because I found myself really drawn to the railroad, the road, the telegraph, and put film in that infra and interstructural type of relation. And it makes me think that this is one of the best history of technology papers I've seen that's not within the field of history of technology, because you're actually dealing with imperialism and capitalism, things that historians of technology
a little reluctant to kind of move into in this way. So would you agree that film is, as this network and this system that you're addressing, do you see that as a vital late 19th, early 20th century infrastructural form that's starting to emerge? Because the dates that you kicked off your talk correspond almost directly with Thomas Hughes' giant study on networks of power, where he's studying electrification, particularly in the U.S. So I thought there's a really fascinating overlap between that type of history of technology research and this way that you're trying to encourage us to consider film. They're not just getting caught up whether or not it is documentary or not, but it may be both, but something else is really integral to this emphasis on kind of global capital and imperialism that you're focusing on.
Thank you, Ray. Yeah, nice to see you. That's a great question, and I think you've sort of answered it. I think you're right. I think that increasingly, it seems a lot of people want to think about infrastructure, and want to start thinking about, well, what is infrastructure and how is it orchestrated. And I think it is one of our tasks to think, well, what is film in relation to this? And it's a form of infrastructure, and it's a curious form of infrastructure as well. And in some respects, it seems to me that it's significant to many of us because some of us, myself included, are in a discipline that's called film studies. So we tend to study film because it's in the name of the discipline that we happen to now be in. But in this case, I think something like radio is probably massively significant and really rather not thought about as carefully as it should be within a broader discipline, I think, of what media studies should be. And this is why I think the media studies school here is an astonishingly brilliant development. Because radio is established straightforwardly by the U.S. military, with rolled out with support of GE and AT&T in particular. So you've got state capital entwined in establishing a network that's first thought to be a communicative device, but then ultimately becomes a broadcasting device. It's infrastructural. It connects through AT&T lines. Right, the way in which radio worked was through those long lines that AT&T was celebrating in 1915. That's how radio was carried. So AT&T controlled the lines, and GE controlled ultimately the radio patents. So here's a development of infrastructure that can be straightforwardly traced to state and capital imperatives that produces a media form that is straightforwardly infrastructural. Now, I think that film is partly that, but just as it were one step before that. So I think some of these land-grant institutions that I'm interested in, so the kind of work that Greg is brilliantly doing is sort of tracking the movement of some of these films. I'm beginning to think that we are seeing here the networks that we didn't really know existed in certain ways. So there's a network of extension departments at land-grant universities that circulate film in regions in particular ways. Could be seen as a sort of as an early infrastructural form of what becomes radio and then ultimately becomes television and ultimately becomes the digital. So if you think about it in those ways, I do think that, yeah, they're connected, but I'm not, yeah, I don't know if I can quite say that cinema's infrastructure. I can say that it's, I guess, ultimately intertwined with infrastructural developments. No, thank you. Prixie.
I want to say also, second comment was made, I think this is one of the most recently stimulating talks I've ever in
Huh. Thank you.
I also want to say your observation that corresponds spread of vicious, racist, and racialized concepts, I think is worth the nation. I think particularly I'm intrigued about the role that printing films and why you also, if you've ever seen the work of a man named John Grieveson, who's done a great deal of work on the role that American mining engineers have played in the copper belt, and I suppose in South Africa, bringing, they thought, a special kind of set of insights about how you work with those people in these poor nations, black people, et cetera, et cetera. I just think that this is just such a wonderful piece of
Thank you. That's very kind of you. I don't know the work, and I'll take the reference from you later if I may, and I'd like to read it. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there's this. I don't have a good answer to working through how race plays through with logics of capital in this way, but clearly this is all predicated on racial logics, which assume hierarchies between people and use those hierarchies to generate capital. Yeah, I guess, yeah, I don't have a good response, but yeah, I think the place of mineral extraction and mining in this needs to be thought about perhaps a lot more than we do, and particularly in terms of just the materiality of much of the culture, the media culture that we participate in. I mean, I have you know, several iPhones in my family, and those things are predicated on mineral extraction that is usually deeply exploitative. And there's no escape from that. I don't, as far as I can see, in the kind of media cultures that we live in, I don't think there's any escape from that kind of deep implication to these processes. I don't know what to do about that other than not buy Apple. But Greg, have you got an answer for that?
No, I don't have an answer. But I do have a question. I probably have to so what happens when we get fine grains about the cost, like USDA? The film you mentioned is one of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of films that the USDA made, and probably the percentage of those that were designed for the South are really small.
They've got regional films. One of their functions is to imagine a regionalized America, I think. And they're the Forestry Service, and they're doing road films, and they're doing, you know. So what happens when we get more fine-grained? Do you think it amplifies the analysis, or is there nothing more to say once we've established the larger terms that this is state? In other words, that the state is using film in a particular way. Does it matter if we get any more fine-grained that those conditions changed in land grants from 1910, 1915 to 1925 to 1935, vastly different catalogs of films being circulated, like at IU, for example, or Purdue? Do those distinctions matter?
Yeah, I think they do. I think, yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a very hard one to answer, and so partly kind of methodological. So part of my particular strategy in writing the book that this partly comes from is a sort of, yeah, it's a kind of attempt to try to think about this as a big picture. But then how does one marry a kind of overarching argument with detail and with the kind of bottom-up detail that needs to make that argument? How do these two things connect to each other, from thinking about detail to thinking about the bigger picture, thinking about the bigger picture, thinking about the detail? I don't have a good answer for that methodologically. I mean, my own structure is just something that you kind of come up with, and I like the micro. I want the micro detail, but I want to see how I can make that micro detail part of a bigger picture. Now, if that micro detail changes across particular moments, then that's crucial and significant. But you know, it's a scholarly problem of trying to write a broad history that takes account of detail, but at times has to scamper across some of that detail in order to keep focused on these bigger pictures. And I don't know what's a good answer to that. I think we probably need both, as it were. I think we need both strategies, both mechanisms, and I think they should be talking to each other, as it were. So trying to think about this as what is the state doing, should also be thinking about what's happening when the USDA changes its film catalog in 1934. I don't know what that looks like. It's hard to do it. My book is too long. I have to take 50,000 words out of it. So I'm not adding detail, I'm stripping detail. I think I guess the response that I came up with when I was hastily scribbling an introduction to my book was, I think the big picture, the big dynamics are what we need to pay attention to, as well as the molecular detail. And I think that we can find contestation for some of these arguments, and they would be valid. But I think that we need to think about, well, what is going on with how media is being orchestrated and articulated to produce functions? And I think at times we can get lost in detail that avoids us thinking about the actual, that has historically in the discipline in some respects. And my sort of, I don't think we should pay too much attention to I think we should pay more attention to the broader dynamics than sometimes happens in the discipline. And sometimes that means that those broader dynamics will be wrong and will be overstated. But I think in some respects we need to overstate them before we can come back to sort of figure out precisely what's taking place, and really sort of get into the nitty-gritty of that. I don't know if that's a good answer. It's not a very good, it's a complicated methodological question that I don't have a good response to.
Well, I think it plays so clearly into the topic that people are talking about, even about identity.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, 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 and in a way that oddly, so this book I started writing this book like 12 years ago. It's crazy how long it's taken, really. But part of it was doing some what you're suggesting. It was going through those catalogs and thinking, what are these categories? What do these categories mean? Why is this called this? And trying to work through that. And at a certain point, I just became overwhelmed by the complexity of the fact that the categories mutate, transform. It's almost impossible to write a history of non-theatrical in that sense without just being utterly overwhelmed by the kind of amount and complexity of this. And ultimately, it mutated into trying to think through, well, what are the logics of this? What are the dynamics that are in play here that we can extrapolate away from those more detailed accounts? Josh.
Just intuited at the beginning the idea of propaganda, you came back figure out, trying to think about where this formulation leads us thinking about propaganda. And you mentioned that in certain ways it's become a term that people don't use often because in one part kind of hype term is the legal idea, the assumption that it necessarily works. And the other part that it seems to be um, so textually obvious that it doesn't provide space for us to do things that it needs to do to kind of work. I think that's part of it. I think the other reason is that propaganda has become essentially discursive, right? I mean, propaganda is just now something that people describe that their ideological enemies do. It seems to have gotten removed somewhat from institutions. And your emphasis is to locate it back in if you think about it in relation to institutions, right? And so one of the things I'm trying to think about is in kind of the new neoliberal, some of these new neoliberal models, does propaganda still function the same way? Are you thinking about it more as a historical sort of mechanism? Does it still exist now? And if so, like what kinds of institutions? And you're locating it in relation to the state. I mean, you expanded, you went back from where it's often thought to start 20s, especially kind of emerged in the 30s. But totally on board with how you bring it back further. But is it still an idea that can take hold? Are you really trying to think about it
It's a good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer, but I don't know if I mean I sort of try to suggest at the end here that look, in a sense, a lot of this non-fictional state corporate produced material ultimately becomes less central to a media system, and one could locate that around late 1920s. Prexy and I were talking over breakfast, for example, about the 1927 Radio Act, which is the very significant, one of the probably the most significant media policy ever established in this country, which is that radio should not be a pedagogical device, but should be financed by sponsorship and advertising, right? So a media system should be connected to consumer capitalism. Once that decision is made, it seems to me, I mean, I'm going to make a broad observation. I think the non-fictional and the didactic slowly becomes less central, and the emergence of a new corporate media system fully synced together with the logics of consumerism and advertising that's sponsored by it. A media system which is synced with advertising from corporations is not likely to be critical of corporate systems, right? It's just sort of axiomatic. So in that sense, I think broadly speaking, maybe I'm going to go out on a limb and say propaganda is absolutely extraordinarily significant until the fully syncing together of a media system that becomes consumerist, corporate, and largely entertaining, largely predicated around celebrity and entertainment. That itself, once that system's in place, we don't really need propaganda. That is the propaganda. Priya.
So this is a question that I got asked for my proposal, so I'm hoping you will answer it because it's a question that I'm struggling with. But I mean, I completely also agree about the articulated power relationship question of imperialism as well as seeing it from both communist sector deliberately threatened and the state power conceived in the war. But how does one also respond to the important communication and issues that we will hear about, not the time this way, not the Julian William Hanson's century experiential device to have a distinction between what we really have here in how we move forward. We will get that going, or this
Wow, crikey. Um, I guess my question might be, well, what would be the advantage of seeing them together? I mean, I don't, I'm not, I guess I'm not really clear what what is gained by thinking of these things as a new form of modernity, experiential. What are we gaining by thinking about these things in that respect? Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I guess that it goes back to, yeah, in some respects that the complexity of a totalizing argument, an instrumentalizing, totalizing argument that I've just presented, and the messy contingency of the reality, and and there's a difference between those things, and that's what I think Greg is talking to as well. And I recognize that. Yeah, I think that's as it were a valid critique. My response, which was sort of mangled with Greg, was, well, yeah, that's right. There's large parts of this big picture that loses the molecular detail, but I maintain that the big picture itself is a significant picture to sketch, from within which we might then ask different questions about molecular detail and the different functions or utility of cinema. The idea that people can watch these pedagogic films that are seeking to make them do things, but do different things with it, of course. Evidently, people resist. There is agency. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. No, I think I think it's, yeah. Thank you.
On that note, let's thank Lee.
Thank you.